Well, good day, everyone. I was thinking recently that most people, I think, who discover something existentially worthwhile, something extraordinarily worthwhile in their life, love to share it. And that's the case with myself. Of course, in my case, I woke up to the possibilities of living a better and fuller life when I was about 16 years of age. My brain woke up, I started to reflect on things, and I was suffering a certain degrees of unsatisfactoriness, especially when I noted that all my friends at school, by the time we were 18, were very clear about what they wanted to do with their lives. Some wanted to go to university, some wanted to go back on the farm, the property, some wanted to go into business, but I was altogether unclear, and that was very disquieting to me. But my father was a psychiatrist, a bit of a closet mystic, if you like, who had a huge library. And one day I pulled down some books on Hindu mysticism and Buddhism, read them, and immediately my interest was excited. They made extravagant promises, extravagant claims. Do this meditation, meet this guru, follow the Eastern spiritual path out of India, and you'll experience personal transformation. An experience of the highest truth and eternal freedom from suffering. Well, I thought that sounds good to me, so where do I sign? So the long and the short of it is that I bought a motorcycle. I jumped on a ship, floated to Ceylon in those days, Sri Lanka. This was 1968. Rode around Sri Lanka and shot up through India looking for a guru who'd come on very strong recommendation as someone whose mere presence or touch would transform my life. And that was Swami Muktananda. Oh, by the way, my friend Michael Sharif just mentioned that John Denver actually was a devotee of Muktananda. And he's just found a clip of John Denver declaring that he was flying to India to meet Muktananda. So there I was, probably 20 or 30 years before John Denver ever found him. So I finally got to the ashram in India. And Muktananda turned up several days after I arrived in a 1962 blue Mercedes, of all things. That was big time in India, let me tell you. Mainly bullock carts and old Fiats. That's all they had in 1960, 69 then. He turned up in this Mercedes. He was this very handsome man, dynamic, with Versace sort of gold-rimmed sunglasses, wearing flashing orange silk robes. And Muktananda, of course, was a Swami, a sadhu. And I was immediately surprised because I thought Muktananda would look more like a grey-haired holy man with a peaceful expression on his face. But by contrast, this fellow was very dynamic. He brushed past the 4 Westerners who were there at the time with the 15 or 20 Indians prostrating on the roadway as he passed. And he was lightly brushing them with his feet, saying, look out, this is a fast train. So this was an extraordinary introduction to probably one of the most remarkable men I've met in my life. So I'd gone there to learn to meditate well. Prior to coming to India, I was a failed meditator. I found that very difficult. So within a few days, I had a chance to have an interview with Muktananda through the translator. Told him why I'd come, to get my meditation fixed, if you like. And he said through the translation, simply, don't worry, everything will be fine. Well, within days of that, I was sitting literally on a full tiger skin paws, tiger skin head in this meditation room, in this beautiful ashram in Ganeshpuri, Maharashtra state, India. And I was sitting there struggling to meditate, and all of a sudden, I was completely surprised. And I looked up, Muktananda was standing over me, and he took his hand and brushed my hand across my forehead and both cheeks, turned on his heels and left. And momentarily I thought, my goodness, I was surprised, but I was at the same time delighted, because you see, I'd received the touch of the guru. And you have to understand that Indians hold their gurus higher than Catholics hold the Pope. He's the Coryllium stick, the philosopher's stone, the one whose touch or presence or teaching can transform a person's life. So after all, that sounded pretty good to me. I received his touch. Now, he was renowned for being able to awaken what he called the Kundalini Shakti, the Kundalini, which is a force spoken of in the Indian scriptures as a residing in a dormant form in the bottom of a person's spine. Everyone in the world has this dormant potential. And when it's awakened either through techniques of meditation or breathing rhythms, or more particularly by the grace of the Guru, the Guru's touch, then spiritual evolution and transformation is rendered spontaneous. It's the intelligence of the life force itself. And when it activates, in this case, through the touch of the Guru, then spiritual work becomes supposedly effortless. So I was excited. I had this touch, but nothing happened. I thought, this is a bit odd. I was supposed to have a marvelous experience. A week passed, but I wasn't to be surprised. All of a sudden, my body started to rotate in a gyrating motion. I wasn't doing it. I was quietly satisfied. It was remarkable. I was doing nothing. It had nothing to do with hypnosis, suggestion, or hysteria. I'd sit there, and all of a sudden, my body would start to rotate like this. I could stop it at will. And the moment I allowed things to happen spontaneously again, it would begin. And as each day passed, it became more and more and more exaggerated. Until eventually one day, probably several weeks later, a Canadian chap turned up. He said, Michael, let's go and meditate together in the meditation room. I said, sure. So we went there. And as we sat down, this chap said the 23rd Psalm. Well, I was familiar with that from my schoolboy days. I got the Three Bears version of Christianity, 10 years of boarding school. In fact, it was the same school that Prince Charles went to. It was a pretty flash place. And remembered it. But in that moment of the Canadian speaking it in this environment, in this context, the beauty of it was exquisite. And as I responded to that beauty, what had awakened in me just a few days earlier, the spontaneous process, exploded into 10 times its power. And I was flung to the floor. I started to, now this is a little dramatic. I'm not given to exaggeration or hyperbole. I'm just telling you exactly as it was. I started to crawl my way across the floor like a ferocious animal with terrific power and strength passing through my body, growling like a lion. You might have heard similar things, accounts from the Toronto Blessing, or there's this Christian stuff in Canada, and this many years ago. Anyway, I was completely captivated, completely amazed. My mind was in no way affected. It was completely physical at this point. I was aware of the Canadian fellow chanting the mantra, Om Guru Om. He was so, later he told me, so freaked out. He said he'd never seen anything like it, similar to an LSD freak out, as he put it. So anyway, the point was that I wasn't to resist this. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't concerned, because I knew from accounts that I had received the awakening of the Kundalini Shakti from Muktananda. It was touted as the intelligence of the life force itself, that it was benign, it was a blessing, and all I was to do was to surrender to it. Well, anyway, after this few minutes, this explosive experience, I rose to my feet with this tremendous strength. And from this day, from that day to for the many years that I was involved, this activity went on totally spontaneously, without any additions or subtractions by me. Important to add, nothing of myself was there. It was not like psychodrama. It was automatic, spontaneous, dynamic, and seemingly intelligent. There were spontaneous breathing rhythms. There was seeing of light, sometimes a blue light, sometimes a black light, which is most peculiar. Moments of peace, not long moments, but short moments of intensive peace. Then further physical activities. My body would assume all sorts of yoga-like postures altogether spontaneously, gymnastically performed. Anyway, the point is that I was so tantalized and so fascinated by those experiences, and so believing of the promise of personal transformation, getting over all my limitations, a change of heart and mind, that it was this experiential stuff that really engaged me. It wasn't the Hindu chanting, because I was in that monastery for that ashram for 5.5 months, doing 3 or 4 hours of chanting a day, meditate. Look, a very dynamic, very intense daily routine, something like you may have seen in Sister Benedictine monastery in the 12th century or whatever. But it was not that. It was not the Hindu Play-Doh colored statues in the gardens. It wasn't the marble floors in the temple. It wasn't the sonorous sounds of Hindu chanting or the procedures or processes or practices. It was just those experiences that grabbed me. This went on for 5 months. I went back to Australia. I continued meditating. But at the end of that period of time, there wasn't a single benefit that I could attribute to these experiences, which is interesting. So I went back to Australia and then later to America and did a lot of the leading edge personal development programs of the day. What I mean by leading edge is I mean they weren't the $150 evening programs. These are expensive things, you know, $400, $500, $600, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 programs. Forum Est that set me off in the early 70s. Then silver mind control. A lot of these things contemporary young people might not have heard of, though they're still extant, they're still going, they're still being taught. And then I came across an extraordinary program called Avatar Training. I flew to America to do that. And it was a belief engineering training, as a matter of fact, which was kind of interesting. And a characteristic of these trainings was this, is that you were exposed to a new data, new information, a new practice. There might be an experience of some sort, a cognition, a realization, which would generate hope. Interesting, things are going to change. We're on the road to success here. But the characteristic of nearly all these experiences was that after a while of time, you'd leak back to the same old self, same old limitations, the same old temperament, the same old disposition, those same old parts of yourself that you'd probably prefer to be without. So despite the fact that none of these experiences were sustainable, I was a seeker. I kept looking. I was very involved in the practices of the old age movement out of India. I was using the mantra that Swami Muktananda had given me, the guru that started that spontaneous process. It was Soham, which means he I am, which is actually an affirmation that I am God. That's what the mantra is, he I am. And of course, the God they spoke of was Shiva or Parabrahman or whatever you like. I practiced that mantra regularly. I gave myself to a couple of hours of spiritual practices every day, contemplation, meditation, form meditation with the use of the mantra, and also giving over to this spontaneous activity that had begun with the awakening of the Kundalini. Despite all this, yet there was nothing really to speak of in terms of personal change or transformation. Plenty to be engaged in, plenty to be interested in, plenty to be hopeful for, but no real result. I pressed on. Not only did I have this really good experiential penetration of the Eastern spiritual tradition and the new age, if you like, trainings and courses under the umbrella of the human potential movement, but I actually created my own program called the Decision Principle Training, which was given to me by a revelation, basically in a tea house in India in the 70s, which I later turned into a course. And I taught this in Switzerland, France, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States between 1988 and 1994, I think it was, very successfully. But then I became a corporate consultant in the mid-80s, and a high end. What I mean by that is I was one of 6 people who delivered a corporate cultural change program, the biggest one that's ever to date been delivered in the Southern Hemisphere, to Australia's second biggest company, Telecom Australia in those days. And we taught them a broad range of personal and organizational development strategies like communication skills, goal setting, belief engineering, think tanking, customer orientation, incredible. We put 15,000 people through these trainings. So I'm only saying this, not to blow my own trumpet for goodness sake, but just to point out that I've really had somewhat an exhaustive, not exhausting, exhaustive exploration of human potential. Again, old age movement out of India, new age trainings, and the pragmatic world of corporate consulting. Now, if this weren't all enough, I decided to go into retreat one day, locked myself up for 10 days, seeing no one, speaking to no one, hearing no one. And on the second one of those, I had a remarkable experience. And it's important to stay at that moment. There was no meditation, no quietude particularly, no, I wasn't trying to manipulate my consciousness in any way. I was just in a completely plain state of mind as I am talking to you right now. And I was getting ready to settle myself onto a couch. And all of a sudden, the image of Jesus Christ formed up in my chest cavity. And with the image simultaneously came the conviction of who it was. But within 1 second of that, there was an experience beyond all words can tell. And if I was to step it down into the poverty of language, there was an openness and love coming to me from Christ, to me, of cosmic proportions. And an invitation and a welcome, as if to say, give me your life and breath and I'll take care of you. An armless embrace, if you like. But, oh, my goodness, I was amazed, delighted, but I didn't know what to do with it. I mean, I'd had a lot of experiences before. And it was a personal experience, utterly. And it was as real as anyone I'm looking at on the screen right now or in the room right now. But, you know, I'd done a little bit of Christianity. I had 10 years of chapel every morning at a boarding school, 1.5 hours of starched collar, church on Sundays. I'm sure the gospel was promoted, talked of, spoken of, but very poorly taught because no, didn't interest me. I thought, what's all that about? I liked the hymns. I liked the stained glass windows. I liked the pretty chapel we did everything in, but that was about all. But I was cool, you understand. I was a yogi. I was a meditator. I'd been with the creme de la creme, Muktananda, been my guru. For 13 years, I'd met Satya Sai Baba. I'd lived with Osho at that time, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. His name was Rajneesh then, Acharya Rajneesh. I lived with this chap. He was later to be the famous Osho of the Orange people. I lived with him in his apartment at Kemp's Corner in Bombay in 1971, perhaps. So I'd been around. I'd explored the world of personal development and the pragmatic world of corporate consulting. So here I was. What was I going to do? I'd done everything under the sun. And then Jesus turned up. I'm amazed. I didn't know how to respond. I kept doing all my old practices, but I could never forget that personal engagement with the person of Christ. So a year passed. I went to the United States of America to run introductory programs to a training I produced. And it was during that time in Berkeley, on the cusp of Berkeley and Oakland, California, that a second event took place. It occurred over a 3-day period. As if pushed into me from outside myself was the conviction that everything I had done, the thousands of hours of meditation, the cognitions, the practices, all forms of mental disciplines, had all added up to a huge fat zero. Now, that might sound like an extravagant statement, but what I mean by that is, look, I had no regrets. I'd done all this. It was engaging, it was interesting, it was satisfying somewhat. But as for a change of heart or mind, zero. As to a change of disposition, temperament, aspects of which that I wasn't so happy with, zero. So I was there in California, and I was driving 40 minutes a day, catching these evangelical radio preachers on the radio. I thought, my goodness, they're good talkers. I remember that was the first thing I thought. And I thought, no, I'm interested in this. I'd never heard people teaching so well, so adroitly, so clearly, so compellingly from the Bible. I was an open sort of guy. I'll listen to what they have to say about Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam. I'll listen. So I listened with interest, and I became further and further, more and more engaged in what they were saying. So I must have listened to 150 hours of top explanatory or expository preaching by this time, without any contact with any Christians. I have to emphasize that. I sent away from the tapes. I listened on the radio every day. And I really became quite well educated to the first principles of Christianity, who Christ was and all his promises. I found the cross and the resurrection a little bit confusing. I wasn't quite sure how that worked. But it was Christ's promises that really got my attention. And I created and taught this program called the decision principle. After all, the first principle of existence. There's nothing else but the consequences of your decisions. If you look back, I thought, by Jove, I'm going to decide for Christ after all this time. I remember that remarkable engagement with the person of Christ in a visionary encounter. I remembered his invitation, as if to say, give me your life and breath and I'll take care of you. So I said, that's it. And coincident with that commitment to find him out and to decide for him, I saw a big billboard somewhere on the road saying, in Berkeley, Billy Graham coming to town. I don't remember the wording, but everyone from my generation had heard of Billy Graham, of course. He was the, if you knew one thing about Billy Graham, he pulled a vast audience and he invited people to decide for Christ. So I went along to this huge gathering in 1997, September, in, I don't know, remember where the stadium was. It was in Oakland or something, maybe in Berkeley. Anyway, 22,000 people were there. And I went along to make, for one reason alone, to make a decision for Christ. Not to hear Billy, because I've listened to the top expository preachers, galore, but just to make that decision. So I went there, 22,000 people assembled, invited people to go down to the middle of the baseball field or whatever it was. I was down there like a shot out of a gun. I was so close I could almost reach up and polish his shoes. And when the moment came to decide, I made that decision, surely, definitely, no turning back. And from that moment, I was never quite the same again. It was silent, undramatic. There was no falling down and hoopla of any sort, no black smoke coming out my ears, nothing like that. I thought, wow, something had changed. It was quite subtle, but distinct nevertheless. And I struggled to find the words to cover it. Something came to rest in me at that moment. The seeking was over, if you like. I was about to say come home. Well, I didn't know what home was, but it felt like home to me. And I described it as existential rest, even a better way of describing it than saying peace per se. But most importantly, it came with new meaning and purpose, and yet more of value to me. It came with a change of heart and mind, somewhat a change of disposition and character that was not of me at all, but wholly of grace. All these years, I'd been practicing works and disciplines, ways and means of re-engineering myself, my consciousness, all aspects of myself, all of which had failed. And here was the grace of God, the Holy Spirit apparently now entered me, that was changing things of his own accord, if you like. So I was supremely grateful for that. So this was a new life. I found myself mixing with Christians. I had nothing in common with Christians. They were not my type at all. But I had the gospel, the good news. I had the grace of Christ. I had this new life sparked within me. And this is what I had in common. But you see, now, what was that? The 24 years have passed since that day that I decided for Christ. And within 3 or 4 years of that, someone persuaded me, and it was not of my own persuasion, to write this book, From Guru to God, Experience of Ultimate Truth. It was available around the world for about 7 or 8 years. It's gone out of print now. but it was available on Amazon.com, and you could buy it in bookstores in all over the world, in Europe and America, but not in Australia for some peculiar reason. Anyway, so I wrote that book, but since then, there have been many years that passed. And in those years, I've reflected very deeply about all those years. Those 28 years I experienced in the Eastern spiritual tradition, particularly before I came to Christ, and the years that followed. The juxtaposition of those realities, seeking to understand where the Eastern spiritual tradition comes from, what's its source. And I suppose, in my opinion, not all Christians would agree with this, but their attempt to find salvation or enlightenment, release from the trammels of human life. After all, the Buddha said life is suffering. Jesus said, you will suffer in this life. So I think it's been their best shot without the grace of Yahweh, without the grace of infinite source, Almighty God, who created this whole show. It's their best shot at getting out of the soup, if you like. So they're both the traditions of the Hindus and the Buddhists, if you like, have been a struggle to discover through keen observation, through experimentation, how one, by some degree or wholly and completely, as some of them claim, to be released for eternal freedom. Now, release for eternal freedom, that's an interesting idea. Let me put it that way. And all the years that I was involved in the Eastern spiritual tradition, I don't think that there was a single person, historically or otherwise, maybe one or two freaks, who ever were able to stably enjoy what they point to as the ultimate reality called enlightenment. Now, many people have glimpsed that reality, and I'm not glimpsed it as I have. I'll describe a couple of occasions to you in a second. But what has been a part of my deep thinking and reflection from something short of a vast experience of these things is there is a distinction between enlightenment and salvation. They are not synonymous in any way. Jesus Christ did not come to bring enlightenment. Jesus Christ did not come to this world to bring enlightenment in the Eastern spiritual sense at all. He came to bring salvation, which is quite different. It's the way of grace alone, through faith alone, because of the work of Jesus Christ alone, and altogether not of yourself. So that, first of all, makes it not marginally, but radically different from the Eastern spiritual tradition, whether it be Buddhism or Hinduism. The notion of grace doesn't appear in Scripture, as far as I can tell, until the 13th or 14th century in India. And some people believe that concept came into the Hindu teachings and doctrines from the Christian influence back then. Anyway, who knows that? But the point was, it's the Eastern spiritual tradition, and its quest for enlightenment is altogether works-based, practices-based, disciplines-based, your self-effort-based, teachings-based. Whereas in Christianity, salvation that Jesus came to bring comes by grace alone, again through faith alone in the person of Christ, because of Christ's work alone. Christ's work on the cross in taking upon himself everything that separates us from God, our sin debt and karmic debt, if you like. And of course, in the Eastern spiritual tradition, the whole quest, whether it be in the Buddhist or Hindu, high Hindu mystical tradition, is to free yourself from karma. And karma is linked to the concept of reincarnation. And of course, how does one free oneself from karma? That's a joke. Almost impossible. So they postulate the idea of living eons upon eons upon eons through life after life after life, suffering or enjoying the fruits of one's actions in one life as you reincarnate into the next. So having said that enlightenment is almost unattainable, even to those people who've practiced hundreds of thousands of hours, as I have, as others have, literally for 28 years, but glimpsing something which is beyond the ordinary, something supra-rational, something supernatural, the quest for enlightenment is a futile undertaking. Another comment I like to make that distinguishes, or that a feature of the Eastern spiritual tradition, is that reincarnation is considered by them anathema. It's the worst thing. It's their equivalent of hell. Even though in the Buddhist and the Hindu tradition, they postulate multiple heavens and multiple hells, the fact is that you're going to be cycling between the agony and the ecstasy, heaven and hell, and everything in between for eternity until you free yourself from this karma, is tantamount to a form of hell. And that's what they seek to free people from. And I find it very interesting, almost ironical, that contemporary New Age teachers who promote the idea of karma promote it as a kind of acute thing. Everyone's in process. Of course, karma exists. You're always growing towards ultimate reality. Never mind, it's benign, it's fine, you're doing well. In other words, they're promoting karma as reincarnation, I should say, as no, it's fine, of course, it's inevitable, it's reality. Whereas the whole quest of the Eastern spiritual tradition, it was considered anathema and something from which to free yourself at all costs. And as I've reflected on things since being with Christ and his being in me and my being in him, then everything on the cross, he took everything upon us that separates us from God. Our sin debt, it's interesting. Sin is considered a debt biblically. And there's a sort of a slight crossover into the concept of the karmic debt. It's an existential debt from which we have to be freed. And the only one who paid any debt that we ever had, sin or otherwise, was the person of Christ on the cross. So there's a distinction there. So I'll just share with you a couple of examples of enlightenment, since Christians don't talk about it much, even Christians apologists. I've never heard them speak of it, or if they do speak about it, or if they do speak about the Eastern spiritual tradition, it's often spoken about bearing somewhat false witness to what they believe, what they reach for, and what they teach. Anyway, so this was back a couple of years before I became a Christian, found new life in Christ. I was sitting opposite someone doing some sort of a spiritual exercise, and all of a sudden, the angle or the width of my vision expanded, probably 10% on either side. It was almost a cinerama outlook. It was most peculiar. And whatever I was doing with the person opposite me, I said, no, I don't want to go on with this. Just hold on. Something's going on. I want to see what's happening. So I got up from my seat and I walked out into a corridor where there were two men talking. One was leaning up against the wall. One was standing up. They were conversing, one seated, one standing. And I just watched them with fascination. They were no more real than puppets in a puppet show. Physically, the scene was exactly the same, but the entire reality of life had disappeared. It was though I was witnessing a dream. And in that witnessing, I could see that what they were how they were conversing together, that it had no weight, it had no gravitas, it was just empty. Every touch of sting in life had disappeared, most peculiar. But it was then, during this experience, which lasted about 30 minutes before everything started to close down back to ordinariness again, that I realized this was a classic state of enlightenment, or one form of enlightenment the Hindu tradition speaks about, called the Turiya state, which is the state beyond waking, dreaming, and sleeping. They talk about the fourth state. They call it the fourth state of consciousness. You know, we're all aware of being awake. We're all aware of being attentive in dreams. And we're all aware of oblivion in deep sleep. But here they talk about the fourth state, which is the Turiya state, which is what I was experiencing there. And what they're posing is that life, as we commonly experience it, is a complete illusion. And the quest for the meditator, the quest for the aspirant in the Eastern spiritual, particularly the high-end Hindu mystical tradition, is to free themselves from the trammels of ordinary existence and end up in this state of enlightenment called the Turiya state. In my case, it lasted 30 minutes. Well, how sustainable is that? The first spiritual experience I ever had, and I'm pointing again to the Eastern spiritual tradition, was when I was about 18 or 19 years old. I went out onto my father's veranda in Melbourne, Australia, and it was dusk. The light was going down. I was looking at the silhouette of a tree that had lost all its leaves in winter. And not the silhouette, but the silhouette of a dove flying behind that tree. The beauty of what I was looking at so captivated, so fascinated me, so delighted me, that in that moment in time, I completely disappeared. What do I mean by that? There was a complete annihilation of self, and an unalloyed ecstasy accompanied that. And the moment I realized what I was experiencing, the experience could not coexist with the realization of its being had. And this is why it's completely extraordinary. There was no self. There was an annihilation of self. And of course, for you or me or any person to experience anything, there has to be a self experiencing something. So this was supra-rational, beyond all conception, beyond a matter, energy, space, or time, and beyond self. It was other dimensional. And yet it was so extraordinary that later I believed, and you could have your own opinion about this, is that I experienced the essence of God had itself before his name and form or anything. So it was supernal, it was exquisite, it was the end of the road as far as I was concerned. Again, that lasted for a split second in eternity, and that was enough for it to be fully realized, fully experienced, and completely compelling. And yet, how fascinating is this? There was absolutely no impact on my the quality and texture of my life whatsoever. So there again, that was the fruit of the Eastern spiritual tradition. I don't say that these experiences are very common amongst aspirants, but these are the sort of things they reach for and hope for. They hope that if any of this can be sustainable, then that sustainability exists beyond the grave and they're ultimately free. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I don't believe that it's sustainable in anyone. I believe it's probably an experience linked to the physiology of the human body. And with the end of the human body at death, then all grand, marvelous, and wonderful possibilities are extinguished for them. So I've written a paper called Salvation versus Enlightenment, which goes into all these things a lot more than I've just briefly described now.